So I really encourage you to look at this exhibit about redlining. What I'd like to get out of this is, again, I'm imposing a little bit of where I would be without having been in our neighborhood, is I wouldn't have known a whole lot about that, or I may not have even known what the word meant. So anyway, today I'm hoping there's going to be a greater sense of awareness and more thought processes as we go forward as a city, trying to think about the city we would really like to have and how we could really be proud of the city that we have. And I'll also encourage you, you may have noticed the photos here were by Doug Ing. Doug is a longtime friend of mine. He was a tax and accounting client of mine for years, a very talented guy. He's a guy who had both a software development company and now he's doing professional photography. He has an exhibit at MoCA that will show the pictures of our two downtown waterways that go into our beautiful river, that is Hogan's Creek and McCoy's Creek. So I'd really suggest you see that because that's also part of our tale of two cities. So I'm going to start off. You might see as we go through this that we've talked about this some in terms of the questions. I would say it has not been overly rehearsed. So some of these things may be as surprising to you as they are to me. But for starters, Suzanne, tell us, I guess, two or three things. You know, one, how you came up with the idea of doing this exhibit. Two, what it's been like being a community activist in Eastside and what it was like to move away, coming back to Eastside where you'd grown up. So that's probably a three-part question. But
yes, thank you. Thank you to the Cathedral for having us today and allowing us to provide this really great exhibit. Thank you to Jack and Alan for being here with us today and all the work that you do in the city. So I'm Suzanne Pickett. Again, I'm the president of Historic Eastside CDC. The Eastside neighborhood is the neighborhood just east of us between Cathedral District, Springfield, and the river. How many of you are familiar with the Eastside? Okay, so quite a few of you. Well, the Eastside was formerly a thriving African-American community. So I actually grew up there. My grandfather lived right on what was then Florida Avenue, which is now A. Philip Randolph Boulevard. So the sports entertainment district and all of that is actually in one of the neighborhoods of Eastside. They've actually changed it now for downtown, but it is platted as an Eastside neighborhood. And as Jack mentioned, I grew up there. I moved away just right across the river like most people. And I couldn't wait to, as a child, I couldn't wait to get out of that neighborhood because of the conditions of the community. But my family owned a property there. And so I came back to rehab that property. I was going to be there 6 months, and that was 11 years ago. But what I saw that wouldn't allow me to leave was the condition of the neighborhood. It was exactly the same as it was as a child. My house is actually on a park. Our family home is on Flossie Brunson Park. And everything from the glass that was on the ground looked exactly the same. So I really got involved. I just wanted to find out what was happening. I was sort of oblivious as well because I had, been suburbanized, I guess, moved to suburbia and, everything was great there. And I was just curious about, what was going on in this neighborhood where it had no investments, no basic resources, and void of a lot of civil liberties for the residents in that community. So I got engaged with LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporations. At the time, they had a study about neighborhoods, and they looped, Springfield and Eastside was together. And if you're familiar with any of those neighborhoods, you know that the demographics are completely the same. So when funding started to come, all of the funding went to Springfield. And I inquired about that, and they said, well, Eastside doesn't have a representing neighborhood to do anything or to represent the people in the community. So of course, there went my retirement goals, and I, formed a neighborhood organization, Eastside Community Coalition, just with the residents to find out what their needs are, to see if we can get some of those resources that were coming from the city and the federal government into the Eastside neighborhood. became that Eastside Community Coalition. 2 years later became Historic Eastside Community Development Corporation, because there was so much of a need. So in this community, we have to serve that community comprehensively, and there was so much of a need. So there's not one thing you can do. You can't just provide housing, or you just can't provide social services. You can't only provide workforce. You have to comprehensively serve. And so when I did a deeper dive into what was happening, the East Side is facing gentrification, displacement of the neighborhood. It's the last historic neighborhood of downtown that has not been displaced yet. Well, has not been displaced. We're going to say it's not going to be displaced. It's going to change, and we have a word that we coined. It's called withintrification in addition to gentrification. So, and that is just so our neighborhood can thrive in complementary of all of the development around us. And it's neighborhood driven, so it's community driven. So as opposed to some investors coming in and saying, hey, we think this is a great parcel, let's put a hotel here and let's put some planned unit developments here. They come in and say, hey, it's a neighborhood here, it's people here, let's go in and see what they want. And then we can find options for impact investing, which is very possible, right? We've seen it, models of it across the country, so it's very possible. So when those investors come in, I would give them tours because it was hard to explain. Now, you guys see the photos of the houses. It's really hard to explain that in the neighborhood. So investors would come and I would give them a tour. I said, well, let me give you a tour of the neighborhood so you can see the blighted houses. There are 600 vacant lots in the East Side, how that came to be. And I will always get the question, how did the neighborhood get like this? I mean, some strange questions, like do the people work? Do they have income? How did the neighborhood get like this? So I would say, well, redlining. And then I would get these strange looks, like not a lot of people know what redlining is. And when I would explain it, I would just get jaw-dropping responses, like, why would anyone do that? Like I was making it up. And if you see it, if you have read The Color of Law, or if you've seen the video, you would wonder, why would anyone do that to any demographic of people? And I, myself as a visual artist, so I always do that last. I forget to start with that I'm a visual artist. And so as a visual artist, I just came up with what I can do. I can paint and create and beautify buildings and beautify neighborhoods. And that's how this exhibit came to be. I felt it was really important to use this exhibit to get people to understand redlining and to help dispel the myths of poverty in our neighborhood, because the people who live in these houses and they're in these conditions, they're not in these conditions because they want to be. And they're not in these conditions because they're lazy or they don't work. They're really in these conditions because of intentional policies put in place by the federal government to prevent a certain demographic of people, mainly African Americans, but not just African Americans. And basically any demographic that was not white at the time were denied these basic liberties and these basic resources. So this is how the exhibit came to be. And I think it's a beautiful exhibit. There are 8 artists in the exhibit. And then we just really basically explain how redlining in the 1930s still very much affect our communities today.
Well, a couple of things intersect with me, and then I'm going to go to Mr. Professor Bliss, that a verse that means, and I can say this since we're in church, Dean Kate, a verse that means a lot to me, and I've thought about it a lot as particularly in our experience in our neighborhood, is Micah 6:8, and I'm paraphrasing, where it says, what does the Lord require of us but to do justice, act kindly or with mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And one particular translation I have says in verse 9 that if we do those things, then we'll have wisdom. Well, when I hear Suzanne's story, that doesn't meet the requirements of justice, kindness, or wisdom. And then the other thing that intersects with me, I've had a business career, and so my natural default position is to think about terms in business. How do we make investments and get decent returns? Well, one of the things I'm going to be hammering on is, it's poor business not to invest appropriately in our neighborhoods. That is just poor business. With that, I'm going to turn over to Professor Dr. Bliss. This guy has an interesting background. Now, Suzanne is not just an amazing artist. She's a business person, a community activist. Dr. Bliss, he and I share some commonality, not the doctor part of it, but we've both been expert witnesses. So he's the only guy I've met who has been an expert witness as a real estate appraiser, sold real estate, went back and got ultimately a doctorate in a history-related subject. So Alan, I'd like for you to start off. Give us a perspective of what you saw in your career as a real estate, both broker, appraiser, how that works in this whole redlining, what you see as some of the ongoing effects now. As Alan, as Dean Kate said, is the executive director of the Jacksonville Historic Society. So give us your perspective from your, I think, very unique background.
Well, thanks, Jack, and it's Alan, please. But I would just like to add something to a couple of points that Suzanne made, which is that the historic Eastside neighborhood is particularly fascinating and really, I think, well worth a visit and a careful look. It is among all the neighborhoods of Jacksonville that I have experienced, the old urban core neighborhoods. I'm fond of saying that it is the least written upon of any neighborhood. It has certainly undergone socioeconomic change and disruption, dislocation, suppression of property values, all the issues that Suzanne was referring to, certainly there. But all of the changes and all of the suppressive influences appear to have originated from outside the neighborhood. There have been larger forces, economic, political, social, cultural forces in play that have created the impediments to appreciation in property value and neighborhood coherence. We have seen those things happen in other places, and perhaps one of the most commonly recognized sort of parallels in Jacksonville is the La Villa neighborhood. Unlike the Eastside neighborhood, La Villa experienced a disruption from forcible demolition during the era of urban renewal by the city of Jacksonville and by the disruptive effects of the introduction of limited access expressways, especially Interstate 95, the corridor that moved through the near west side. The Eastside neighborhood has had some disruption in the 1950s and the 1960s from the construction of the Matthews Bridge and the expressway that approached that, but nothing like what we have seen from the disruptive effects of an interstate. What you see as a result in the Eastside neighborhood is it's almost like a museum piece. It is an artifact of the way urban neighborhoods used to exist. So if you drive or walk or bicycle through the Eastside neighborhood, which I encourage you to do, you will see homes that are very similar, if not identical, to the style and the method of construction and lot sizes and driveways, parking arrangements, very similar to what you would have found when you visited that area in the 1910s, the 19-teens, and the 1920s. You will see neighborhood stores, no longer active in most cases, but that was typical of neighborhood patterns in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. People shopped close by to where they lived. You will see small churches and small neighborhood congregations were very typical of not just African-American neighborhoods, but also very common in the ethnic neighborhoods that were populated by Eastern European immigrants, by Italians. Catholic parishes tended to be small and close at hand to the neighborhoods. And you still see the built environment that exists, very similar to what was in the 19-teens and 20s. Those churches, in most cases, in many cases, no longer active, but some of them have been reactivated and now in the service of new congregations and new religious leadership. Some of the old small stores just closed up, in some cases converted to some alternative use, but you can tell what they were built to be. You just don't see that in many other neighborhoods, none other of that age and vintage that I've seen in Jacksonville. It's one of the things that gives, I think, a lot of energy and hope to the withintrification impulse that Suzanne was talking about, and it's pretty exciting stuff. Suzanne mentioned A. Philip Randolph Boulevard, and it's no accident that what used to be the main street through the neighborhood, Florida Avenue, has been renamed in honor of the late Mr. Randolph. A. Philip Randolph, for those who don't know, was born in Crescent City, just about 40 miles south of here, moved to Jacksonville when he was 2 years old, and went through the remainder of his education and formative years here in Jacksonville. After graduating from the Cookman Institute here in Jacksonville, and Florida's first high school specifically for African Americans, Mr. Randolph worked at a variety of jobs in Jacksonville for a few years, and then decided that there was nothing here for him, and left for New York, and proceeded to become one of the most influential civil rights leaders in the history of the United States, if not the giant in American civil rights history, and a giant in labor history. The author and architect of the Marches on Washington, and the progenitor of what became the famous 1963 March on Washington that made Martin Luther King famous. It was not Dr. King's idea, it was Mr. Randolph's idea and his planning and execution that led to that. He's a great Jacksonville son, and I don't think we do enough to celebrate him in this city. We ought to do more, and the fact that he grew up on Jesse Street, just a couple of blocks off of Florida Avenue in the East Side, I think is just one of the many markers of neighborhood identity that really gives us more of an opportunity to get traction with that. Suzanne has mentioned, and Jack has mentioned, and the focus of our conversation has to do with the idea of redlining. And I have taught about this in courses at the University of North Florida. I was originally hired at UNF in 2006 to teach a course that had sort of gone dormant for a number of years called American Cities and Suburbs, and it's urban and suburban history. And the issue of redlining really fit in with my background, which Jack mentioned has to do with real estate. I did a lot of real estate appraising in my time. I was a real estate broker in residential and commercial brokerage. I did some development and construction. And I remember one particular appraisal assignment that I was given by a bank loan officer. A loan officer handed me the keys to a building, and he said, "Now, when you go out to look at this place, be careful. It's a pretty rough neighborhood." And it was a foreclosure of a two-story commercial building that had been built in the 1920s, just on the outskirts of downtown Tampa. And when I got there, it was abandoned, doors broken, hanging from their hinges, windows broken, and it was about a block and a half from the Interstate 275 expressway. Obviously, the introduction of the interstate had radically changed the neighborhood. But it really was provocative to me to look at that building and think, you know, this was, at one point, this was someone's pride and joy. And they marshaled all these resources to build, create, design, operate that, and now look at it, just a challenge for anyone. So when I had an opportunity to go back to school, which I had not done in my misspent youth, and get a degree in history, I focused on urban history, and it gave me a chance to explore questions like that. Redlining is a term that was created by a homeowners activation, a group of home neighborhood activists in Chicago in the late 1960s. It had not actually been established as a practical, legal, political policy concept in the 1930s, but it refers to the practice of real estate appraisal maps, like the one that you see an example of on the wall at the back end of the room. And an agency of the New Deal was created in the early 1930s to solve a big problem. After the economic crash of the late 1920s and the onset of the Great Depression, foreclosures spiked all over the United States. And people lost their homes. If they were homeowners, they lost their homes to mortgage foreclosure. If they were renters, they were evicted because they couldn't pay their rent anymore. And so solving the housing crisis was one of the great challenges of the FDR administration. As was typical with many New Deal initiatives, they didn't feel as though they had a magic bullet, but they started trying things. And if the first thing didn't work, they tried something else. And if that didn't work, they tried something else. And the first step was to form something called the HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the HOLC hired local real estate appraisers in 62 urban markets across the United States to draw maps of real estate values and assign risk levels to those areas according to what they saw as the relative danger of a real estate mortgage being foreclosed upon. And they used colors, as map makers typically do, to identify different areas. And so that sort of led to the colloquial term redlining that emerged. Real estate appraisers, and Jack Meeks has heard me wax, not particularly eloquent, but he's heard me discuss this. Real estate appraisers and real estate agents are, I think, two of the most insightful and astute, if sort of creepy, observers of American cultural behavior and aspirations. And people who are in the real estate business, when they meet someone who says they want to buy a home, how many in here have ever worked in the real estate business, by the way, ever had a real estate license? If you have, you probably don't need me to tell you this. A real estate agent meets a prospective home buyer and thinks, well, what can they afford and what kind of a neighborhood would they most feel comfortable living in? This is totally instinctive second nature. It requires no consumption of brain cells on the part of a real estate agent to go through this process. And it happens within microseconds of the first meeting, and the process continues to refine itself. Real estate appraisers operate in much the same way. A real estate appraisal is actually a history. It looks at the trends in the neighborhood. It looks at the surrounding property owners. The real estate appraiser evaluates the condition, the level of maintenance, the quality of the original construction, how well the lawn is being kept, how many cars are parked in the yard that don't seem to be being used, and they form those impressions about a neighborhood, and it informs, in some ways, at a subconscious level, their impressions about the prospects of the neighborhood. I will say that there wasn't a real estate appraiser ever born who needed to have an HOLC map handed to him or her to figure out what the risk level was in a neighborhood. These maps originated at the local level from local appraisers doing what they had been doing for their entire careers and continued to do. What the HOLC maps did was codify the racial and cultural assumptions that were already baked in to the practices of the real estate industry and the mortgage lending industry. They reflect, in terms of their map, a snapshot in time in the 1930s. But the effect of these maps was to, as I said, to codify these assumptions and then to sort of bake them into the lending practices of first the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and then later the Veterans Administration, VA, mortgage lending program. And it was on the strength of those two government programs that home ownership in the United States took off and came out of the gate roaring at the end of the Second World War, and it drove the nationwide rate of home ownership in the United States from the mid to high 40s in the 1930s to the mid to high 60% range by the 1960s. In 3 decades, in 30 years, we increased the rate of home ownership in the United States by close to 50%. That change stabilized in the 1960s, and it has been at that level ever since. It reached a high of 69 and some odd fraction of a percent, I think in about 2006 or 2007, just before the great economic crisis, the so-called Great Recession of 2008. And it has ticked back down to as low as 62%, and I just checked this morning, and the nationwide rate in the United States is now at about 65%. The United States government has indeed formulated policies to promote and sustain home ownership. And some of them have made a difference, and others seem to have made very little difference. But in every case, what they have done, what those policies have done, and what economic incentives have taken place have not worked as favorably for people of color or people of any other kind of minority as they have for white Caucasians. And they also tend to work more for the benefit of people whose socioeconomic standing inherited or acquired during their formative years or acquired through wealth accumulation on their own in their generation. All of those Americans have benefited more, considerably more, from the policy incentives behind home ownership. We give people the freedom to, we give people access to a tax deduction. Right, on our income tax forms, you can deduct the interest on your home mortgage. That was never really an intentional process. Congress passed a law allowing the deduction of interest of any kind in the 19-teens, but it only became meaningful in later years when more of us tended to own homes and have big mortgages. And the bigger your mortgage, the more valuable that deduction is. And the bigger your mortgage, the more likely it is that you're someone who has enough of an income that a tax deduction will make a difference. So who benefits from the mortgage interest tax deduction? The relatively affluent households, and those tend not to be racial minorities. The defense and the explanation and the opposite argument for the mortgage interest tax deduction is to say, well, it's a good thing because it stimulates home ownership. There actually is no evidence to support that. The rate of home ownership in Canada actually is about 3% higher than it is in the United States at present, and there is no mortgage interest deduction in Canada. So the playing field really for that incentive to home ownership is tilted in favor of the affluent. Real estate lending in the years up until the Great Depression was very, very local. Attorneys tended to be the source of real estate loans. They brokered loans as agents for banks or individual investors. And people would borrow money to buy a house, but you couldn't borrow money unless you had at least 50% down. There was no such thing as 10 or 15 or 20% down. So home ownership was acquired at excruciating cost and effort after years of painstaking savings and accumulation of a down payment. The term for mortgages was anywhere between 4 and 7 years. The idea of a 10, 15, 20, 30-year mortgage, unheard of until the years of the HOLC and the FHA. Those were some of the big innovations of the New Deal. For the first time, people could buy a home with a relatively small down payment and have a fixed monthly cost that they could project out decades into the future. And it gave people, for the first time in the United States, the hope that they actually could work their way into a position of stable home ownership and not worry about getting thrown out at the end of 7 years if someone wouldn't renew their mortgage. That short-term crisis, short-term amortization, an early balloon was what led to the foreclosure crisis of the early 1930s. That was a problem that the FHA sought to fix. Well, I've gone on probably at greater length. Sorry, this is the professor in me creeping out.
You hadn't gotten the hook yet. Close, but not yet.
Did I answer your question, by the way?
Oh, I forgot. It's sort of like the attorneys when they talk too much in deposition. I forget what the question was, but you gave us some really great background.
I succeeded in confusing Meeks anyway. So,
well, we'll get to that. I want to go back to something with Suzanne, because I've got a couple of examples of this, and of course now anything that looks like redlining or appraisals that aren't being done appropriately are not supposed to be allowed. But do you have any current examples of where you're still seeing something that looks like redlining in the Eastside?
So we actually do have right now what's happening nationally is appraisal equity opportunity. Because in appraisals, of course, homeownership is the one way, the largest way to build wealth. So appraisal equity homes in lower income or minority neighborhoods are appraised at lower value. A really great example is so there's Eastside in Springfield is separated by a railroad track, Palmetto Street. There's a new home on 3rd Street in Springfield. It's about a $500,000 home. If you take that home and put it right on the other side of the track, not one block over, we will be told that it couldn't appraise for that same amount. So we are still seeing those effects, the effect of redlining and those policies, even still in the home values of minorities.
Well, and a couple of examples too, because we had the same thing. We had the same builder who was building homes in our neighborhood in the early years when Joanne and I were in historic Springfield. And that builder built a couple of homes over in San Marco. And I think they sold for, then, this goes back over 10 years ago, 12 years ago or so, they sold for over $100,000 more. A recent example, I don't know how many of you saw this. This was a New York Times article that was, I would say within the last year or so, and it was related to or told about a couple here in Jacksonville, a mixed race couple, and how to try to get an equitable appraisal of their home, they took down pictures of their family. So when the appraiser came in, the appraiser wouldn't see, in effect, the color of their family. And even more recently, one of the ladies in our neighborhood, who's a person of color, the appraisal she got for her house was probably 20 or 30% less than what was expected. And even going back now, this goes back almost 20 years ago now, when Joanne and I were looking to buy our house, the first realtor we talked to, who was a friend of Joanne's, wouldn't even show us a house in that neighborhood. So these things. Oh, here's the next question, and then maybe we'll go to some audience questions because they didn't get a full lunch. I don't want them to get, what's the word, hangry on us. So it's real obvious that for most middle-class folks, having a home and building home equity is one of the primary ways to build wealth. So given where we are now, and let's use the East Side as an example, how do we help that occur in terms of having people build wealth in their homes, given all the impediments that have occurred? And I'm going to move out to the audience so we can move towards some audience questions. But I'd like for both of you, starting with Suzanne, to weigh in on that.
Okay, so one of the programs that we have right now, which is actually mentioned in this great Jacksonville Business Journal article, is Restore and Repair Program. Because, of course, the challenges is being able to repair your home, but also using your home as equity. So in our Restore and Repair Program, this year, in partnership with Lift Jacks and LISC, we're repairing 20 homes of residents, and most of the residents are long-term residents, elderly, or have been in the East Side their entire lives. And with that repair of the home, then those residents will need an appraisal. But they should appraise, so it should increase their value, and it will increase the value up to $75,000 in these homes. And the photos that Doug took, actually the photos in the back, those are the homes. So we're doing an entire street. That's Van Buren Street, and those are the homes that we're repairing. And in Eastside, we have about 6 residents that are still over 100. And we chose that street was chosen because most of the senior residents live in those homes. So we'll be able to repair those homes, and that's one way that we can mitigate the issue of home ownership as well. Also, in one of my roles, I am a housing counselor for the Jacksonville Urban League. So I provide first-time homebuyer class that's needed through various down payment and closing cost assistance programs. But through those programs and through the support, allowing those families to take homebuyer classes, because it's very much needed, because just like with anything else, if you've never done anything before, you need to learn how to do it. So homeownership is no different. I know some of us, are good at some things, but you really want to educate about what it is, transitioning from a renter into homeownership. So those are some of the ways that we can mitigate that and help these families build wealth.
That whole attitude, I know.
Jack, can I add to something in response to that question of yours? Just a couple of things in addition to the incentives and property restoration improvement, being able to incentivize and support those things and make them available. I think the quality of infrastructure, streets, sidewalks, street paving, signage, parks, all of the things that the public trust really has a responsibility for, those things tend to be better maintained, better built, and more modern in areas where there are high property values. And that's a change that I think that local government can make that is within its financial capability and within the scope of its resources to do. And that helps strengthen the coherence, the confidence in a neighborhood, and also to make available the resources to just, I think, just strengthen the sort of the aesthetic, the optics of a neighborhood and build on its identity. Something as simple as acknowledging the heritage, the legacy of somebody like Mr. Randolph, I think is a way to strengthen the identity of a place and make people really psychically put their heart and mind around the idea that this is a place and it has a history and it has an identity.
You know, those two things, I grew up, I think, in fairly modest circumstances, but we always had a home. I wasn't living in a rented place until I went off to college, and then so I was just always assumed that I would own a home someday. But that's not a working assumption for a lot of people, and I think there's a real important educational aspect to that. And then I didn't know what it felt like until we moved to our community to have busted streets and busted sidewalks and environmental issues and zoning that didn't make any sense. It was a detriment to the neighborhood, and there's plenty of that bad zoning in our neighborhood, and there's as much or more in the Eastside neighborhood. And the homes were there first, and then you see businesses that were put there that are clearly a real issue for the neighborhood, environmental and otherwise. And as you have a chance, look at these various boards here in this presentation, because this redlining and what's happened affects all of these lifestyle and quality of life issues. Well, before I start preaching too much, if someone has some more comments or questions, I'll circulate around and let you have the mic.
It's really not about redlining as such, but it is about getting into the neighborhood in terms of, do we still have as much active discrimination in sales within neighborhoods, or is it based on income?
Oh, very much so. Even the higher income African Americans, when they want to sell their house, they still are by their agent, it's still suggested that they'll get a larger appraisal if they remove any indication or even sometimes bring in someone else that's not of color as a representative to sell that house. And it just happened recently to a colleague of mine. His house appraised for $90,000 less. And it also requesting a second appraisal because you have to pay for appraisals out of pocket. So his house appraised for $90,000 less than the comps. He made those changes, got another appraisal, and that appraisal was comparable. So it still happens very much today.
There was a significant study done recently where they tested for that. The hypothesis was that color drives appraisals and it also drives home sales.
Yes.
And so they had people put their homes up for sale and found consistently that the ethnically decorated homes, or the homes that appeared to belong to black people, did not fare as well. Same exact home, same exact everything, but didn't always sold for less and appraised for less. I mean, they've actually been able to see that. And then that led to a good bit of study on our subconscious racism, the role of subconscious racism, where things are happening and it's not, they don't realize they're doing it, so it's not that people are evil. There's a lot of subconscious racism still going on. It's still a significant problem, even with the new laws.
It was in the 1950s that Dr. Martin Luther King famously said that the most segregated hour in America is Sunday morning at 10 a.m. But I would argue that perhaps a close contender to that is any time at the real estate office or in the real estate appraiser's office. It is just it is the legacy of a lot of inherited assumptions about yeah.
Any more questions or comments?
Hi, thank you so much for this awesome conversation. I have two quick examples and then one question about the Eastside, kind of going back to that equity piece. One example, as you were asking, is this still happening? We moved back here in 2004. I was actually in Iowa City at the time, and I was renting a house. But part of the condition of the rental is that I had to help sell the house for the owner when I left after that time. So that was fine. I did that very thing. I had removed all of my all of my African American, my family pictures. This was in 2004, so this is not, and it's still happening. So I actually did that, and we didn't get a second appraisal, but the house, sold. But that was even part of that. So, and the realtor recommended that I do that. So anyway, so that's an example. Well, it's, like we just said, that's just how it is. And so, I had to move forward. But thank you for that. And then I guess the other question, I did have another example anyway, but the question I wanted to ask, kind of going back to the Eastside piece, which the work that you're doing, Suzanne, is awesome.
Thank you.
I'm hoping that you're going to continue to get more support. I'm going to even talk to you afterwards. But so in terms of when the houses get fixed and even when they get up, I think is so important. How do we help also, or what efforts also are being done to help those homeowners stay in their homes, let's say when those houses, and not even just those, just in general, so that they don't get taxed out? Is there any assistance? Is there protection for that so that they can stay in their homes and they're not taxed out? Because we see this all across the country in areas similar. So that was my question. So,
Thank you.
then also
That's a great
to
question
those legacy
as
homes.
to other ways we assist. So we do have a program that helps the homeowners pay their taxes because most of these older residents, the seniors, are on a fixed income. But we also make sure they've applied for homestead, which a lot of our residents and our veterans are not getting the benefits that they deserve because of just the process. And a lot of things are moving online, which makes it more challenging, but that's a different story. But we also offer financial education, right, for homeownership. A lot of the properties that we're talking about, especially on Van Pierre Street, some of them are heirs property. So they belong to a parent or a grandparent, and the grandparent just moved and kind of left the property without going through the proper probate. So we have a huge heirs property issue. But we have a partnership with Three Rivers Legal where we actually send those clients because in the program, it has to be owner occupied. But even then, we actually refer them to Three Rivers Legal to go through probate, so they become the owners of those property. So again, it's a lot to mitigate, but we try to find, and we are definitely a service-based, right, and a needs-based organization. And we only realized this, going through the process. We didn't think about heirs property until we actually started restoring the homes, and it was a great issue. And it slows down the process of getting the houses fixed. We also provide financial education. We provide ways for them to save so they can take care of their own future repairs of the homes, and so they can pay their taxes as well.
Well, maybe time for one more question or comment.
I just was wondering, is there a Habijax program type thing to help those homeowners renovate their homes?
Habitat is a large builder in the Eastside, and they're a great partner of ours. But Habitat is not necessarily directed to the repair portion of the homes. They do still build new homes, And their homes are, Habitat builds affordable homes, but even now today with the rising costs of just everything, construction materials, it's even a challenge. Affordability is even a challenge right now for Habitat. Habitat homes? Yep. So these are renovations. Yeah, that we do. And if it's any home. So it could be a Habitat home that they built 30 years ago that may, as a matter of fact, we have done a few of those that we have actually done repairs on as well. We welcome that. Yeah, we actually we actually are in talks with Habitat about and some other. We have a lot of companies that come. For example, CSX just came. So we have a lot of companies that come out just as Habitat to help us either build or renovate or beautify. Yeah, so we welcome that. Volunteers coming in and assisting us with. If you are a plumbing company, because again, the cost of materials, if you're a construction company, we welcome that assistance because our program provides $15,000 to $20,000 of repairs. But if you look at some of these houses, I mean, that might just be a roof and a floor.
Maybe.
Right, and it needs a lot more work. So we welcome partnerships from other construction organizations to assist us with that.
Well, I'm going to turn this back over to Dean Kate. I want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank my illustrious two colleagues up here, and thank Jay Wright for getting this wonderful exhibit moved and demonstrated here. Jay is sort of a resource for us here at this church, so thank you, Jay. Dean Kate, thank you for having the idea of doing this. It wouldn't have happened without you.
Thank you, Jack. Let's give everybody a round of applause. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.